Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cognitive Development in Adolescence, a time in which brains are becoming more able to do complex and interesting tasks that involve abstractions. It's also a time when teenagers are very distractible and distracted, and so harnessing cognition becomes a really important task. So what I'm going to do in this video is talk about some of the ways in which adolescents can think in ways that they haven't been able to do before, and some of the challenges they face in spite of their newfound cognitive abilities. One of the things your book is quick to point out is that adolescents speak differently to each other than they do to adults, which is really just attention to the rhetorical situation. It's sophisticated and it's proper. They are understanding that there's levels of formality they can use with their friends that they don't use with parents or maybe their grandmother. This is a point of sophistication, not a deficit, as some people would like to claim, that the way they speak is so informal and kids today, blah, blah, blah. It's really condescending. Your authors of your textbook call the way that adolescents speak to each other on their devices as digitalk, which is like the most cardboard term I've ever heard. Like, if you want to sound really stupid old, I think you should use the term digitalk. It's also funny that adults often fixate on the digital world of teens in ways that go overboard. Yes, we should be worried and concerned if adolescents are getting into situations in which they're going to feel pressure to have sex or something. Yes, we need to worry about that. But a lot of the stuff that you will see like on the news is like cracking the code of children's texts, and adults sometimes make such wild claims. I'm going to put a link to these videos so that you can see, especially the secret code of emojis, because it's really laughable, all of the things that adults read into this digitalk. So in addition to altering their language for each other, they're also doing very sophisticated cognitive moves, such as constructing arguments. And this argument just happened to come out last week. It's a Facebook post by a girl named Brooklyn Wilson, and you can't see it on the slide, but what she does is she writes a rant after a sex ed educator comes to their school and talks to just the seniors, and she's really, really upset that the information the presenter gave was bad metaphors and oversimplified sexuality. I think the metaphor was that boys are like waffles and girls are like spaghetti. Do go read her whole rant. It's crazy. But she's also concerned that any girl who texts a boy first, according to this presenter, has daddy issues. She is horrified by this and she speaks out. And so it's fun to watch and exciting to watch. You may not agree with her, but she's very capable of making this argument. Adolescents are also getting really effective at understanding abstract and difficult things, like the special theory of relativity. Like, I kind of know what it is, but this teenager explains it in ways that make me understand it. And he has to understand it first. And so it's fun to watch his thinking as he decides how to show it to you. There's also a lot of students who are speaking two languages at the same time. The predictions are that by 2030, 40% of our pre-K to 12 grade students will be either limited English proficient or English language learner. What I do want you to know is that processing abstract information, especially in two languages, is very cognitively challenging and therefore worthy of your respect, even if it looks simple from your end. So far, we've gone through Piaget's stages at length, including the sensory motor stage, where the kids put stuff in their mouth, motorboat around. It's very tactile, right? Then in grade school, we get to the concrete operations where they use physical objects in order to understand abstractions like words and numbers. But now, in adolescence, in early adolescence, and sometimes before that, children are able to do more abstract, interesting work, like think about what an idea like loyalty means. So when I imagine you right now, I see you sort of leaning over and falling asleep because it's that time of the semester. And so you may be asking yourself right now, like, why do I need to know about formal, operational, or abstract thinking? And here's my answer for you. Because you will not get it if you don't know what it is and what it's comprised of. And so you will end up like me, getting really crappy student papers because I would ask for analysis but not explain how to do it. So I love this meme. In order to have good boundaries and clarity, you need to learn critical and abstract thinking. So we're not going to teach either one. That's what I did. So I'm like, kids, I want you to read this story and talk to me about the themes. Well, I haven't explained theme to them. I haven't explained how you read for a theme. I haven't thought to myself all of the cognitive moves you have to do to get there. I'm just irritated that I have really superficial papers. Piaget divided this more difficult kind of thinking, which he called formal operations, into a couple of different categories. He defined it as reasoning like a scientist, which means that you start to consider all the variables and the ways in which they interact with each other. Sometimes adults don't do this kind of thinking. It's difficult. And so I think it's worth honoring the process when you ask for something like analysis. So here's an example of a problem that requires formal operations. Think to yourself how you would solve this. And by the way, I stole this off a website. What would you do? It's a great mathy site. It's really great because look at all the variables you would have to isolate to answer this question. Would you rather have the revenue from a Ferris wheel or a carousel ride? Ferris wheel costs 4 tickets. The carousel costs 3. What are your variables? Well, if you're thinking, well, how many people can fit on the ride? How long is the ride? How popular is the ride? Where is the ride located? What does it cost to maintain that ride? Suddenly you have a really complex problem. And those variables aren't all equal in terms of their importance to your revenue. Questions like this, they're real world questions. And real world questions like this require difficult abstract thought. I want to say a little bit about deductive and inductive reasoning because we do both, and one is actually more sound than the other. So when you use deductive reasoning, when you ask your students to use deductive reasoning, it means you're starting with a true premise and working from there. So if all of the music on iTunes costs $1.29 a song, and I just bought a song by Chris Cornell, it's going to cost $1.29, right? So you have to start with if-then statements and follow them very logically. Inductive is the inverse of that. It is that I bought a song by Chris Cornell for $1.29, and so I think, well, then all songs on iTunes must cost $1.29, which may not be true. So inductive reasoning has more potential for error. And the last thing I want to say about deductive and inductive thinking or reasoning is that when we think of Sherlock Holmes, he's always saying deduction, but what he actually does is induction because he's looking at specific clues and trying to draw conclusions about them. If you're at a dinner party and anyone wants to know, you please explain that Sherlock Holmes uses induction. So Vygotsky explained this slightly differently than Piaget. Instead of making it into the concrete formal ops stage model, he calls it spontaneous and scientific thinking. It's really basically the same thing. That spontaneous thinking is based on observations and experiences. This is usually young children. So if they have a grandma that's very loving, they will tend to think that grandmothers are loving, right? Because it's based on their experience. It takes time and age and more formal thinking for them to realize that people have other experiences, that love looks different in different families. And Vygotsky also believed that the cultural tools we use, the computers, calculators, whatever we were using, that those things actually construct the way we learn. So we have this thing called epistemological beliefs. And what that means is how we come to know something. And so when you're a young child, the way you come to know things is you just figure that everybody's reality is the same, that it's a one thing and it's the same for everyone. As children get older, they usually become more absolutist in their thinking. That is, they figure that there's an expert in everything and somebody who knows what's correct and incorrect. Now, without knowing it, a lot of adolescents have moved into the multiplist perspective, which is they realize that knowledge is not absolute, that experts often agree and disagree. And after that, and not everyone gets to this one, they may become an evaluatist. That means that they not only understand that knowledge is not absolute, but they also realize that some arguments are better than others. They don't just say, well, there's two sides to every coin. They can actually see that, well, there's two sides to this coin, or two sides to this argument, or probably more sides to this argument, and some of them are deeply suspicious. That's a pretty sophisticated thing, and it's really cool, and it's worth fostering the ability to do that in your classrooms. So we think with our hearts and we think with our heads. Think about analytic and heuristic as those two things. So when we're making real world decisions, analytic is when we collect all the evidence and we look at it and we weigh it and we determine what it means. And it's formal, it's effortful. But we also make decisions with our heart and by rules of thumb and by things that feel familiar to us. And that's called heuristic. It seems like a lot of our most important decisions we make heuristically. That is, we feel a great deal of affection for someone, and so we decide to marry them. Our best decisions are often made by a combination of our intuition, because lots of times our intuition tells us when something's up. Like, you might have a feeling that your boyfriend, girlfriend is crazy before they start going through all the texts on your phone and smashing it on the driveway. But the point is that real decision making needs a little analysis, or maybe should have a little analysis. So here's the challenges to cognitive development, because it's not easy to do this kind of thinking. And when you ask for it, it's going to be effortful, and so you might get some resistance. One of the things that gets in the way of really thinking analytically is something called adolescent egocentrism, which is that they may recognize that other people have ideas, but they tend to have sort of a black and white version of the world, and they're pretty sure that only one side of that is right. They feel like they're unique and no one ever has had the kinds of problems that they have, and they often feel like they have an imaginary audience watching their every move. Another pro and con to cognition at this age is that their capacity to learn is greatly enhanced by what they already know. They can tie new information to old information. So in terms of the information processing model, they're able to learn more quickly. They're able to think in abstract terms, but they are also highly distracted. And so you see students who are texting while they're also watching a movie, while they're also playing guitar maybe, which means that all of those tasks get compromised. And especially when you're working on tasks that require complex formal thinking, like writing an essay, like solving a proof. You can't, I dare you, maybe you can, but I dare you to do that well without the ability to really focus your attention and to leverage your working memory, because they're very complicated tasks. Now, ADHD, I'm going to throw this in here quickly, because those students are already more distractible. It's helpful if teachers provide very detailed lists about what to do, that they don't expect that somehow you're going to figure out how to analyze for theme, for instance. I also want to mention stereotype threat, because that will get in the way of students being able to really show what they know. Stereotype threat applies to any individual who bears an extra emotional and cognitive burden for fear of confirming a stereotype. For instance, if you're a football player and you're afraid of being seen as a dumb jock, this fear of being seen as a dumb jock can kind of become self-fulfilling prophecy because of the anxiousness. Let me show you what it looks like in this diagram. And I'm going to use my own experience to explain. So take a stereotype relevant situation. Say I'm learning to be a commercial pilot. So I need to learn to talk to air traffic controllers in big, busy hubs, right? So I realize there's not a lot of girls in the air. I don't hear a lot of female voices. I also am insecure about my own voice and the way I sound on the radio. So first of all, I'm in the situation. In that situation, suddenly I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm a girl. I self-categorize. That's the green ones right there. That leads to a state of like heightened arousal in terms of my own emotional concern, like, oh my gosh, this feels big to me, which leads to restricted capacity, because what we know about emotion is it will hijack your cognitive centers. That leads to underperformance. So what happens? I'm afraid I'm going to sound like a girl on the radio. I sound like a girl on the radio. My voice goes up. I'm sound like I'm asking mother, may I, rather than requesting clearance to land. So stereotype threat is worth paying attention to. If you have an underachiever, it may not be because they don't get it or don't want to get it. Something I want to mention a couple more things before I let you go. And one is to avoid bias in teaching. It is so hard because we can't see that bias. But one thing we know is teachers call on male students more than female students. And in my case, I'm sure I did it because the male students were more outspoken. Their behaviors were more overt. A really equitable way to call on students so that you're really trying to get everybody's voice. One of the ways teachers can do this, I think a pretty popular way, is to provide popsicle sticks with their names and you just pull them. But another way that you can help avoid bias is choose, if you're English language arts, you can choose texts by men and women, by people of different backgrounds and races and cultural heritages. You can make your classroom a safe space and an interesting space for diverse populations. If you're teaching art, welcome different art forms. If you are teaching social studies, look at different perspectives. We always seem to look at history through the eyes of the founding fathers or the Union or whatever. Try to think about what other voices, what other perspectives would make history more interesting, if nothing else. STEM fields, science, technology, mathematics, engineering, those tend to be avoided by girls for reasons that are still a mystery. And it usually starts in middle school. And so one of the things you can do if you're a science person is to really encourage rigor with everyone. It's called benevolent sexism when you have lowered expectations for girls than boys. And I think it's also benevolent racism when you decide that you're going to have lowered expectations for your minority students. So the last thing I want you to know, carry this with you if you forget everything else I just said. The characteristics of formal operations are that they are effortful. They take time. That's why you hear teenagers be like, whatever, because it would be harder to stop and think about all the implications. It's hard to do. Formal operations often require students to examine their assumptions about the way things operate. They can actually be threatening to identity in terms of what you feel like you can do and what you feel like you can't do, or the fact that new information challenges your worldview, and they require explicit teaching. If you want students to be able to do synthesis, you need to show them examples and non-examples of that, and not just clobber them when they don't do it right. And it's also worth being aware of your own biases as you create instructional materials that are fair and inclusive for everyone. So, with that in mind, brave campers, I send you off to create posts that discuss applications to formal operations. You'll see there's a couple of choices this week, and I look forward to your thinking.